Welcome to the fourth episode of the AfterSessions. Ignaz Semmelweis, the washed-up doctor.
He worked inside institutions built to save lives. But what happens when the scaffolding of the institutions itself doesn't want to cure, doesn't want to accept procedures meant to save life? Trapped between tradition and evidence, authority and truth, he challenged a system that refused to look at itself.
Behind the white coats and unquestioned routines of 19th century medicine were women dying in the very places meant to protect them. He noticed a pattern so disturbing others would have likely ignored. This knowledge shook the entire pathway of medicine.
What happens to a person when being right makes them dangerous? What happens to them when the friends turn into enemies? In today's episode of AfterSessions, we uncover the life of Ignaz Semmelweis, the washed-up doctor whose history is almost forgotten, the doctor who wanted to heal but was rather forced into hiding.
Doctors heal, but who heals broken doctors? Vienna, 1840s, two maternity wards, one staffed by doctors and medical students, and the other by midwives. A 5 times higher death rate in the doctor's ward.
Women begged not to be admitted to the doctor's ward. Mortality rates were terrifying at 10 to 35%. Mothers died days after childbirth from what was called puerperal fever or childbed fever.
No one knew why, or rather, no one wanted to know why. Disease was blamed on bad air, on fate, on women's bodies themselves.
Ignaz Semmelweis did not begin with a theory. He began with evidence. He carefully compared records and tracked data over time. The numbers repeatedly showed that women treated by doctors were far more likely to die. Rather than attributing this to chance or superstition, he searched for a practical cause.
The breakthrough came when a colleague died after cutting himself during an autopsy. His symptoms closely matched those of women who had died from childbed fever, revealing a connection that could no longer be ignored.
Semmelweis realized that doctors moved directly from dissecting corpses to delivering babies without washing their hands. He concluded that infectious material was being transferred from the dead to the living through direct contact. This showed that doctors themselves were causing harm and that truth proved far more difficult to accept than the disease it explained.
Semmelweis experimented with different cleaning agents and concluded chloride solution could be the trick. He initiated a mandatory hand-washing policy for physicians and medical students after they engaged with corpses.
Mortality rates dropped almost immediately. He had proof, he had data, he had lives saved. What he didn't have was permission to challenge authority. The senior staff of the hospital did not accept his conclusions and got offended that he suggested they were the cause of puerperal fever. In a cruel turn of fate, Semmelweis' temper made him some influential enemies, forcing him to leave Vienna and go back to Hungary.
In 1861, he published his findings in a book that was not well received and was largely ignored by the scientific community. Semmelweis's attitude towards his colleagues probably contributed to his downfall. His contemporaries described him as arrogant and bitter, prone to publicly humiliate his opponents. He also wrote open and angry letters to high-ranking European physicians, accusing them of being careless murderers.
People around him began to feel he was going mad, and in 1865 he was committed to a mental asylum, where he died shortly after the age of 45. Semmelweis was probably beaten in the asylum and eventually died of sepsis, a potentially fatal complication of an infection in the bloodstream. The irony is that it was the same disease Semmelweis fought so hard to prevent in those women who died from childbed fever.
The rejection of Ignaz Semmelweis was not born from ignorance, nor from a lack of evidence. It emerged from something far more human, the psychological cost of being wrong. His findings demanded that doctors confront a devastating possibility, that the very rituals meant to heal had in fact been instruments of death.
To accept Semmelweis's conclusion required an unbearable admission. Physicians would have to acknowledge that their hands, trained and trusted, had carried fatal consequences. They shattered the moral identity at the core of medicine. Healers were no longer innocent, they were implicated.
19th century medicine was built on hierarchy, reputation, and unchallenged authority. Knowledge flowed downward, tradition outweighed data, and senior physicians derived their status not from evidence but from custom. Semmelweis's discovery didn't merely question a method, it threatened the social architecture of the procession itself.
Faced with this threat, the response was predictable. Rather than confront the message, the medical community turned on the messenger. Semmelweis was mocked, dismissed as erratic, and slowly erased from professional life. Changing long held practices required humility. Rejecting one man required far less.
This is a textbook manifestation of cognitive dissonance. When new information collides with self image, people do not revise themselves, they revise reality. By denying Semmelweis's evidence, doctors preserved their sense of competence and moral goodness, even as preventable deaths continued in silence.
What stalled progress was not a failure of science, but a failure of psychology. Fear outweighed reason, identity outweighed truth. Accepting Semmelweis's meant surrendering the illusion of infallibility, and for many, that sacrifice felt more dangerous than disease.
The tragedy of Semmelweis lies not only in what he discovered, but in how others responded. His story reveals a pattern that repeats across history. When evidence threatens authority, rejection feels safer than reform.
Semmelweis wasn't wrong, he was simply early, early enough that the human mind was not yet ready to follow where the evidence led.
Ignaz Semmelweis did not die celebrated. He died confined to an asylum. He was silenced and ridiculed by the very profession he tried to save. He watched colleagues cough as mothers died, even after he showed that something as simple as washing hands could stop that suffering.
Years later, the rise of germ theory, shaped by minds, proved Semmelweis right. Invisible killers existed. Clean hands mattered. The deaths could have been stopped.
This showed that truth does not win simply because it is true. It wins when society is ready to listen. Some ideas don't spread like fire. They linger, they resist, they wait.
To be washed into history.